Hi everyone, welcome to this online session on beginners botany, and this session is part of DCRT's Hidden Heritage Secret Streams project, which is funded by the National Lottery Heritage Fund. It's part of a wider programme of volunteering, community events and more, so feel free to go to our website, which is just here, to find out more about it. I'll be leading the session today with the help from my colleague Matt, who will be managing the chat and any tech support. Matt, do you want to say hello?
Hello, I'm just going to say where you can put your questions.
Oh, brilliant, thank you. Please keep your microphones on mute during the session, just so we don't get any distracting background noise. And we'll also be recording today's session for those that have missed it. So if you don't want to be recorded, please just turn your camera off. And also, if you're struggling to see the screen at any point or things are running a little bit slow for you, I'd recommend just turning your camera off too, and it will speed things up. Right, so in this beginner's session, we're focusing on springtime wildflowers. And spring is a really great time to start learning, as there aren't a huge amount of plants in flower, so you can quite quickly get to grips with what's out there. And all the species we will look at today will start flowering in between March and May time, and most of them appear in April, which means after today's session you can go out and find them. They're all very common flowers that you can find in your local parks, roadsides, woodlands at this time of year, and many of them you may actually recognise, but hopefully you'll learn some common species that are new to you today, as well as getting an overall introduction into the practice of botany. So the plan for the workshop, first of all, we'll chat a little bit about taxonomy, the science of classifying and identifying organisms. We'll talk about some useful books and guides. We'll then go on to learn 9 floral families, the ID characteristics of each family, and some common spring flowers from each one. We'll then go through a roundup of top tips for getting started. And I'll also provide some information on biological recording and collecting flowers. We'll pause for questions throughout the workshop today, just to make sure everyone's up to speed with everything. And as there are a few of us, I'd actually recommend just popping your questions in the chat as we go through, and Matt will select some to read out when we pause. So a bit on my background, my name's Sally Hyslop and I work as the Community Engagement Officer for DCRT. I've been at the Trust for, I've been at the Trust for nearly 6 years now. It's a really varied role that involves providing new opportunities for people to interact with the river's heritage and local nature. Before working at DCRT, I spent a year training at the Natural History Museum in London. I already had a passion for wildflowers and did a lot of identification in my own time, but I learned so much more at the museum. And I was lucky enough to spend 3 months of my time there working within the British and Irish herbarium, so the flower collections. However, I must say before we start, I'm nowhere near an expert in plants. I'm still very much learning myself, and in places I'm actually a little rusty now, but I'm hoping to pass on some of what I learned at the museum to you today to get you started identifying wildflowers. So a little bit about my work in the British Herbarium. So the herbarium collections receive huge quantities of collected plant material from the public. So a lot of this work involved remounting old specimens to what we call archival standards. And some of the plants we got were just crispy little flattened things, loose in envelopes or in newspaper. So I would repress them onto proper herbarium sheets like this, and they'd be included within the collections. So once the specimens were properly mounted, so like we'd press them with these huge old bookbinders and labelled, I would get them to the right place in the collections. Now that's no easy task, as the British and Irish herbarium collections are absolutely huge, thanks to the UK's rich history of collecting and recording nature. Each filing cabinet in the photo here contains hundreds and hundreds of those specimen sheets you just saw. Okay. Oh, we got a bit of background noise there. Obviously, you need some order in a collection like this, or you're never going to find anything. And sadly, it is not alphabetical, which would be a lot easier. The collections are based on taxonomy, and taxonomy is the science of ordering organisms into the tree of life. So some of you may remember this well from your school days or know it really well, but just to get everyone up to speed, we're going to run through the taxonomic ranks that we use to order life because it's quite useful for botany. So the way of dividing life is this way of dividing life is used across the natural world to help us order everything from bacteria to fungi to plants and animals. We start with the first rank, the kingdom, and there are 5 kingdoms that we use to split up all life on Earth, and they are fungi, plantae or plants, animalia, prokaryote, oh god, hard one to say, and protoctista. And those last 2 are more covering single cellular, very simple organisms like bacteria and algae. So as we work our way down these taxonomic ranks, within each of those 5 kingdoms, life is separated into smaller and smaller groups according to shared features and relatedness. Traditionally, wildlife is usually grouped together based on physical similarities that have evolved from a common ancestor, such as whether the animal has hooves or rodent-like teeth. As we work down these ranks, we get closer and closer to what we call a species identification. And by the time we reach genus, we are left with a group filled with species that will be very similar and very related to each other. The distinguishing features that divide one species from another within a genus are often tiny. So for example, it could be the number of hairs on a beetle's leg. So identification of an organism is often much trickier the closer you get to species level and requires more expertise than classifying organisms higher up in the tree of life. So let's use the common daisy as an example. We all know that, of course, it's in the kingdom Plantae, the plants. And next, there are 4 phylum which split the plants up into conifers, ferns, mosses, and flowering plants. And we have a daisy here. We have quite clearly a flowering plant, also called an angiosperm. And all plants and trees with flowers are angiosperms. And it goes on and on like this, narrowing the organism down. Now, in botany, it is especially useful to understand what we call the family level, which we'll be doing today. And in many of the best ID guides you will use, the species are actually organised by the families they belong to. And of course, we're interested in genus and species. In case you don't know, it's the genus and species name together that give us the full scientific name for an organism. So this scientific name is unique only to that species. So for daisy, it's Bellis perennis, and for human, it's Homo sapien. I'll be including the common names of wildflowers today, but I will also include the scientific, sometimes called the Latin name for the species, and the scientific name for the families. But I do just want to say, please don't get bogged down with remembering the scientific names. Slowly they sort of sink in. And also in terms of pronunciation, don't worry about pronouncing these correctly. I'll be getting it wrong throughout this, just go for it. You may be thinking, why do we bother having these scientific names? And that was definitely a question I had once upon a time. But the science of taxonomy is international. So if you went to another country, they would have a completely different common name for the daisy, but they would use exactly the same scientific name, Bellis perennis. So using scientific names allows us to share scientific research and our understanding of taxonomy worldwide. Just going to take a quick drink. Great. Now, I mentioned that the plants are ordered in herbarium collections and often in books using taxonomy, but you should know that taxonomy isn't fixed, it's ever changing. Why is this? Well, we don't know everything about the natural world yet, and as we discover things and new things, everything sort of gets moved around on the tree of life, and the scientific names actually often change because of this. So how we define a species can also be quite tricky. So just like us, plants can be incredibly variable in their appearance. So for example, these flowers here are actually all one species, but you can see how varied they are, especially with their petals. So species will, will vary depending on the conditions they grow in. And a plant growing in extreme conditions, for example, on the coast, will look very different to the same species growing in a more sheltered spot inland. Plants naturally have a lot of regional variation as well, because they're rooted to the ground and they can't travel far to reproduce. So you tend to get pools of different genetic traits in different regions of the UK. Plants also can hybridize. So we know for animals, we know species are different because they can't mate and produce fertile offspring. But many closely related species of plants can actually hybridize, creating specimens with a little bit of each parent. Now, DNA analysis is, of course, really helping with all of this. So for species where there's been a lot of debate in the past, is this one species or is it 3 different ones? The ability to now look at the genetic code can help us make a decision. So onto books and guides. When you have an unknown flower in front of you and you're faced with a book absolutely filled with different species, some of them looking very similar to the others, it can be quite daunting. And this is where knowing the main characteristics of those families can be really helpful, because many books will use the scientific families of flowers as chapters. So instead of looking through every page for a match, if you can identify what family a plant belongs to, you can skip to the right chapter, speeding up your identification. Please don't be put off by the amount of species in these books. The UK is actually one of those rare places where it's possible to learn every species of wildflower. Compared to the tropics, where plant diversity is huge and it would be absolutely impossible to learn every species there, botany in the UK is really bite-sized and digestible. I'm going to run through 3 books that will be really useful for you to continue learning after this workshop. And all 3 of these books arrange the species into those floral families. So first up is often considered the Bible of botany, Francis Rose's Wildflower Key. And this is an illustrated book and the illustrations are fantastically accurate. And the benefit of illustrations over photos is that the illustrator, Mr. Rose, has made a real point of some of those ID features. So you get close-ups of sort of fine detail like the seeds or the flower shape. As well as the colour illustrations, this book has what we call dichotomous keys, which are essentially a series of yes or no questions that essentially work as a flow chart to bring you out to the correct species. Even if you don't use these keys, which can be quite complicated, the illustrations are great and it's a really good book. Francis Rose also includes probably the most comprehensive and useful glossary out of the 3 books. His glossary is pictorial, so there are lots of useful diagrams, and like the old saying goes, a picture says more than 1,000 words. Having these diagrams makes it so much easier to get your head around the strange terminology that scientists use for plants. If the idea of using a key isn't for you, I would suggest Simon Harrop's guide, which doesn't include any keys at all. Instead, this guide includes a really detailed description of the plant and good quality photos. He also includes, and this is a great feature of this book that many don't have, a distribution map for each species. And this is really useful. It's a useful tool for checking your identification is correct. So if you live in Scotland and you think you've identified a plant as black horehound, that distribution map there might make you reassess your identification. And it's again got a very useful glossary at the front. Next up is the Collins Wildflower Guide, and this one has great illustrated pictures again and descriptions. And it does include keys, you can see one just here, but not to the detail or extent of Francis Rose's book. So it kind of falls in the middle in between Rose and Harrop in terms of complexity. But to be honest, any of these books will get you started. They'll all complement each other as well if you want to get more than one. Great, so that's the first bit. I'll take a quick pause for questions now, in case anyone's got any.
We haven't got any questions so far.
Awesome, I'll keep going then. So we'll move on to anatomy now. For identifying most wildflowers, we not only look at the flower itself, but it's also really important to observe features on the leaves and the stem. And there's some terminology involving the anatomy of the plants that's really useful to know. So back again to a bit of school biology to get everyone back up to speed. Flowers consist of petals, and they also have the sepals. And these are both modified leaves that surround the reproductive parts of the plant. The petals are usually colourful or unusually shaped to attract pollinators. And the sepals are the floral leaves that surround those petals. And they're usually green, but not always. And sometimes they can be identical to the petals. The stamen are the male organs, and there can be many of these in one flower. The pollen is held in a sac called an anther at the top of these stalks called filaments. And the carpel is over here, is the female organ, and the stigma is sticky to receive the pollen. And there can be one or several carpels fused together in one flower. Some plants will have bisexual flowers with both the male and female parts, like this example here, and some will have just male or just female. The shape of the petals, plus the number of petals, the number of sepals, and the number of reproductive parts are used to identify wildflowers and their families. The tip of the receptacle, which is the tip of the stem where all these floral parts are sort of attached, can also be a useful feature. Leaf shape is also a very useful identification feature. So plant leaves are either simple or compound. And simple leaves are not divided at all, but they can have lobed parts like these two here, or toothed edges. Compound leaves are divided up into smaller separate leaflets. So this is one leaf and this is actually one leaf, but it's been divided up. And how these leaves are held on the stem is also a useful identification feature. So if you imagine this is the stem of the flower and the flower's sort of maybe at the top, plant leaves up the stem can be held directly opposite each other, or they can be held alternately. So first on one side and the next slightly higher up on the other side, or they can be held in whorls, which is when 3 or more leaves arise from the same point on the stem. So that's 3 terms that you'll hear quite a lot when identifying. So let's get started. When trying to identify an unknown flower, I think it can be really helpful to think about the features that you recognise and whether it's similar to any plants or flowers you already know. So when people first come across this spring flower, the first thing they will notice is those bright yellow sunshine coloured petals. And I just want to ask people, if you can you guess what this flower reminds you of? It might remind you of a school game you used to play. And can you pop that in the chat, please? So any ideas? And Matt will read them out.
We've got what it actually is.
Oh, excellent. Don't read that one out. We'll come to that.
But we have got quite a few guesses of what it looks like. Everyone's basically saying the same thing.
Go on.
Buttercup.
Excellent. That's what I wanted to hear. Thank you, Matt. Yeah, this flower is very closely related to the buttercup. And the family it belongs to is, in fact, the Buttercup family. So it's just an example of using our existing knowledge and thinking about shared characteristics to help us narrow down the identification. And well done to that person who knew what it was, by the way. We'll come on to that. So the Buttercups family scientific name is the Ranunculaceae, which is just here. And sadly, not all species in this family are yellow. That would be too easy. But plants in the Buttercup family usually have a classic symmetrical flower with usually 5 petals and 5 sepals, which is the leafy part at the base of the flower. Although there are a few exceptions to this, like this one here. But all species in this family will have a flower absolutely packed with stamens and carpels, as you can see there. The leaves will also be held alternately up the stem rather than opposite. And the leaves are usually quite lobed and divided for species in this family. And this species was lesser celandine, and it's a real sign of spring for many. The bright yellow flowers are on long stalks, and they have 8 to 12 petals, which are, as I said, filled with stamens and carpels. The leaves are spade-shaped on long stalks, and this is a damp woodland plant. It's very common all over the UK, and it's flowering right now, so you can go out and have a look for this one. And just to prove they aren't all yellow, this one is green Halibull, which is also a member of the Buttercup family. And these aren't naturally common as a wildflower up here, but many people will plant green Halibull in parks and gardens. So it's one you might see out and about quite a lot, especially in urban areas. And this species has the classic 5 petals and 5 sepals. And you can see again, there's that flower filled with stamens and carpels. So it's a classic buttercup shape, even if it's not got that yellow colour. And another not yellow buttercup family member, and another one that's a sign of spring, and this is wood anemone. It's a beautiful star-shaped flower that absolutely carpets the floors of shady woodland in spring. And they're a really interesting species because they don't actually have petals at all. Instead, these are sepals, the bit that's normally green underneath the petals. But they again have those many distinct buttercup-like yellow stamens that are visible, and the leaves are on long stalks and divided into lots of lobes. So there's, I think there's 3 lobes there, which is very buttercup-like. And this is such a sign of spring and also an indicator of ancient woodland. So that was our first family. We'll now move on to our second family, which is the rose family. And this one includes many of our edible fruit trees and plants, apples, pears, cherries, strawberries, things like that. The rose family is very, very similar to the buttercup family. So that flower there, very similar looking. Plants in the rose family usually have 5 petals and 5 sepals with lots of stamens. So like I said, similar to the buttercup family. However, if you look under the flower at the top of the stem, they have what's called a cup-shaped receptacle. And the buttercups don't have this, it's very flat underneath. There's another feature to look for too. Check the leaves on the stem. If they have these tiny miniature leaf-like appendages sort of underneath the leaves, which we call stipules, I think, or stipules, at the base of the leaf stalk, it will be another member of the rose family. Buttercup family members don't have those. And our example is Blackthorne or sloe. It's one of the first hedgerow shrubs to flower, usually in March. And you can see the flower here has those 5 petals and lots of stamens. The branches are very rigid and covered in sharp spines. And the flowers of Blackthorne look almost identical to its relative, the hawthorn, and they do occupy similar habitats in hedgerows, but you can remember that the Blackthorne flowers always appear before the leaves do, whereas hawthorn's leaves actually appear first and it flowers later in the year. As well, the leaves and fruits are quite different in appearance. So our next family is the carrot family, sometimes known as the umbellifers. And the scientific name for this family is the Apiaceae. And the eagle-eyed amongst you will have started to notice that all these scientific family names end in the letters A-C-E-A-E, which is a really helpful thing to know when starting to learn them. The umbellifer family are easily recognised as the flowers are held in these disc-shaped umbels, with flowers stalks sort of radiating from a central point, a little bit like the spokes of an umbrella. The flowers are usually small, with 5 petals, 5 stamen, and 2 stigma. The leaves are held alternately up the stem. And wildflowers in this group include many of the wild plants we have cultivated into crops like wild parsnip, celery, and fennel. And one of the common umbellifers that starts to flower around now is cow parsley, and that's this one here, and a little bit of a close-up there. Cow parsley has that classic umbel of flowers with pure white flowers, and it can be recognised by its pointed fern-like leaves and its hollow stems. So that's one to look out for. Next up is the wood sorrel family. There are lots of introduced species from abroad that we grow in our gardens from this family, but there's only 3 native species in the UK that naturally will grow in the wild. And this species here is wood sorrel. It's a very delicate plant with a classic shaped flower with 5 petals. And the petals are white with sort of lilac veins and a yellow middle. This one can be confused with the wood anemone that we saw earlier. It has similar coloration, but it's these distinctive trifoliate leaves or 3-part leaves that help us to identify them. They look a little bit like a clover's leaves. And these leaves actually close at night or in harsh conditions. Wood sorrel is another sign of spring. It's found in dry, shady woodlands. And the word sorrel comes from the French, which means sour. This plant contains oxalic acid, and it actually used to be used to treat scurvy. I've just found this out when researching the talk, but I thought it was a good fact. I'm just going to take a quick drink as well. So the next family we're going to have a little look at are the dead nettles, and these are one of my favourite families. The leaves can appear just like the common nettle, but they have no sting and very different flowers. So the flowers of dead nettles, the petals are fused into what we call a corolla tube. So they're kind of this shape. So they're not symmetrical at all. They've only got like one line of symmetry sort of down the middle there. And they have what looks like a hood and 2 bottom lips. They also have square stems, another great feature to look out for. And on those stems, the leaves will be held directly opposite each other for every species in this family. They're often scented, they're often aromatic. In fact, this family includes many of the herbs we use in cooking. So your mints, your thymes, marjoram is in this family as well. There are dozens of species in the dead nettle family, but here are 2 that flower in spring and are very common. So we have the white dead nettle, which is a fairly large plant, up to 60 centimetres tall. It's large white flowers, which are positioned in whorls, so around the stem, and it flowers in April. Another very common dead nettle is ground ivy, this one here. And when I first started trying to ID plants, I did a plant life survey that asked me to look for ground ivy, and I genuinely thought they just meant look for ivy on the ground, and I completely did the survey wrong. And yeah, not soon after I discovered that this is what I should have been looking for. It's much more delicate and smaller compared to the other dead nettles in this family. I noticed the flowers are purple, the lips are quite blunt compared to the white dead nettle, and this one can often be found carpeting the ground. And it flowers in March, so it's when you can go out and look for from today. We're going to move on to the cabbage family next, or the Brassicaceae. And you've guessed it, this family does contain wild cabbage, as well as a lot of other edible plants you may know, like mustard and watercress. I'm moving on to this family next, because as you can see in this picture, this species has leaves a little bit like a dead nettle. But notice those flowers are very different. The flowers of the cabbage family are very unique. They're distinguished by 4 equal petals arranged in a cross or crucifix shape. And this gives the family of flowers the alternative name of the crucifers. Within the flower, they usually have 6 stamen and 2 carpels. However, if the flowering season is over and the flowers have gone to seed like this, another distinguishing feature is that they have these upright fruits, which are a bit like a pea pod, but they point upwards rather than hanging down. And they remain attached to the stem for some time. So that's a good way to recognise them later in the year. The one we are looking at, the example, is Jack by the hedge, or garlic mustard. So it's got nettle-like toothed leaves, but look out for those cabbage-like flowers in a crucifix shape. And this one smells of garlic when bruised, and you can eat the leaves. They're meant to be very good in salads. And Jack is a lover of hedgerows and open woodland, and it flowers from April. Cuckoo flower, also known commonly as lady smock or sometimes milkmaids. It's another springtime flower from the cabbage family to look out for. And you're looking for rose pink, whitish petals in a cross shape again. And it has larger sort of kidney-shaped lower leaves, but as you go up the stem, they get a bit narrower and a bit more slender. And this wildflower is a river lover, so it likes wet meadows, stream sides, and wet ditches. And it's often found in big groups in those habitats as well. It blooms from April, coinciding with the arrival of the first cuckoo, a sure sign that spring has arrived at last. Our next family is a bit of a tricky one, so it's the figwort family, and it includes flowers like toadflax and foxglove. And this family is one that can be confused with the dead nettles. It has very similar flowers that are irregular shaped. And you can see from these examples, the petals are fused into those corolla tubes with lip-like lobes and a bit of a hooded appearance. One example you will likely come across is the ivy leaf toadflax. So this is a gorgeous, dainty little plant that most people consider a weed, as it just sprawls on walls and pavements up here, particularly in Sheffield where I am now. But look for ivy-shaped leaves on long stalks and these tiny purple flowers with yellow patches, and they've got like 5 distinct lobes. And this one flowers from May. And one group of flowers in the figwort family that are really easy to recognise are the speedwells. So I wanted to include those. That are a very distinctive common plant. Any patch of grass, it's really worth having a look for these because the flower is very recognisable. So look for this purple, blue colour and 4 petals. But unlike the crucifers, they have an irregular shape. So that petal at the bottom, I don't know if you can see, is like a lot thinner and slender. And speedwells only have 2 stamen as well, so you should be able to see those 2 stamen quite clearly. Speedwells belong to the figwort family, and within that, the genus Veronica. So if you see a flower of this colour and shape, it's very likely to be a species of Veronica. Speedwell species you are likely to encounter include the Germanda Speedwell, Veronica Camediris, I'm trying to read that one out. It has bright blue flowers with a white eye and grows up to 20 centimetres tall. And it's got a hairy stem and it flowers from around March. There's also ivy-leaved speedwell, which is an absolutely tiny version. And this is 4mm wide flowers and ivy-shaped leaves. A very hairy plant, and it can be found in woods and waysides, and it flowers from around April. Speedwell is also known commonly as bird's eyes, and that's because in folklore they used to say it must not be picked or the birds will pluck out one's eyes or your mother's eyes. The name speedwell may also refer to the plant's supposed medicinal properties to support a quick return to health. In the UK, there is only one genus in the violet family. All species belong to the genus Viola. So all the scientific names of these species will just start with viola, which is easy to remember. They have an irregular flower shape, always with 5 petals, and sometimes with sort of back pointing appendages as well. And there are a fair few species that have purple flowers and heart-shaped leaves, just like this. They will look very similar, but if you find one, give it a sniff. If it's scented, it will be our only fragrant violet, which is the sweet violet. And if it's unscented, it could be quite a few species, but it's highly likely to be a dog violet. So that's a quick run through of our first 8 families. Has anyone got any questions?
We haven't got any questions, but I did have a question. Did you say the wood anemone didn't have any petals? It just had sepals?
Yeah.
Right, that's crazy.
Yeah,
I didn't know that.
Yeah, it's just, I guess it's just evolved that way. But yeah,
I thought I'd misheard.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a few like that where it doesn't have petals at all and the sepals just become big and colourful. I don't know why it is.
Right.
It's quite interesting, that evolution.
And so are they closed like sepals?
Sepals... Well, not all petals close, do they?
Right, okay.
And they do on quite a lot of plants, but I don't know if they do on all plants.
Okay.
But I'm not sure. We should do a test. We should watch one at night time.
But yeah, no other questions.
Oh, and sorry, that was the wood anemone, wasn't it? The wood sorrel, the leaves close. It's not the flower that closes. So it's like those 3 trifoliate leaves. They sort of close up into like a bit of a triangle shape at night. Yeah, that's the one that closes up at night.
Nice one.
Awesome. We'll move on to the next bit. So we're briefly going to revisit the tree of life now, because all the flowers and families we've been looking at so far, they have been in a shared class called the eudicots, also known as the dicots, more commonly. So what makes a dicot a dicot? Well, flowering plants and trees in this group all have a few features in common, but the easiest feature to look out for is the leaf venation. So dicots all have net-like branching veins across their leaves, and you'll recognise that from sort of tree leaves falling in autumn. There is another group of flowering plants called the monocots, or another class of flowering plants called the monocots. And these do not have those branching net-like veins, but they have simple veins that run parallel to each other up the leaf. So if you do notice that the leaves have straight veins with no branching at all, you're looking at a monocot. And a lot of the spring flowers we see that are monocots will be part of the Lilly family. And that's our last family today that we'll move on to. So the Lilly family, or the Liliaceae, is a large, diverse family with many species, and plants in the Lilly family all have parallel veined leaves, which are smooth and straight, without any lobes or toothed edges. The flowers usually have 3 petals and 3 identical sepals of the same colour in the flower. So it just looks like 6 petals, really. The petals and sepals can be separate, or they can be sometimes fused into a tube, and they usually have 6 stamens. So wild garlic is one most of you'll be familiar with, particularly as many of us forage this plant in spring for a bit of cooking. It's been out and about for about a month now. The leaves start to emerge in early March, and this is a plant you can easily identify without the flowers, as the garlicky smell of the leaves is just so distinctive. The flowers come later in June and also edible. The flowers are white, they're delicate, and you can count those 6 sepals and petals clearly in the photo. And this is another plant of ancient woodland and damp habitat. You'll find it by rivers and streams in most wooded areas. And our next example is the bluebell. Obviously, this is one you're going to recognise straight away. But I wanted to include it because our native bluebell populations are actually often mixed with introduced garden bluebells, known as Spanish bluebells, which have escaped from our gardens into our wild woodlands. Now, some consider the Spanish bluebell a bit of a threat to the UK bluebell because they are thought to be able to better cope with climate change, and it's suggested that as we warm up in the future, they could maybe even outcompete the English bluebell, which would be a real shame as they're very different plants. So I thought we could go through how to identify them from each other. So the English bluebell, this one here, it's got very narrow leaves, about 1 centimetre wide. And the Spanish bluebell leaves, this one here, they're much wider. They're about 3 centimetres wide. The English bluebell also, it's got deep blue, narrow tube-like flowers, and the tips are curled right back, whereas the Spanish bluebell's flowers are paler and they're often more bell-shaped as well. The English bluebell also tends to have its flowers all on one side, so it gives it kind of a drooping appearance, whereas the Spanish bluebell, the flowers are just all around the stem. And the English bluebell also, it smells great. It's got a distinct sweet fruity scent, whereas the Spanish bluebell is actually scentless. Now, both species have those white and pink variants you sometimes see, but sometimes you'll also come across a bluebell with features from both of these species, and that's very likely to be a hybrid bluebell. So it has one parent from each species. So next time you see a bluebell, have a closer look and see if you can identify it. Right, so we've just got another break for questions. Are there any in the chat, Matt?
We do. Two of the same question, basically.
Okay.
So how can you tell the difference between petals and sepals if they look so similar, like in wild garlic flowers?
That's a good question. And you know what? I don't know if it's actually that important to know the difference, if that makes sense. So like when you're looking at a flower, if it's got those green sepals underneath the petals, you'll know they're sepals straight away, because they normally, in most flowers, they're quite obvious. They're smaller green sort of leaves that surround the petals underneath. But yes, like sometimes, as we've discussed, they can be evolved to look like petals. But yeah, I don't think it matters too much, because you won't see the sepals, so you'll know that they're sepals and petals, if that makes sense, or just sepals. Hopefully that explains that. Just shout it.
Another question, do English bluebells only grow in England?
I think they are endemic to the UK. I think that, yeah, I'm pretty sure, you might want to fact check me on it, but I'm pretty sure that they are just an English species. Actually, I don't know if you even get them in Scotland. In Scotland, they have the harebell more, which is a Campanula flower. So it's in a different family. But yeah, fact check me on that as well.
And do you know how threatened English bluebells are?
It's kind of unknown. So I was involved when I was at the museum in a project called the Bluebell Project, which was a citizen science project to sort of get people to go out and actually document what was happening with the English and the Spanish bluebell. I think the main risk is that what happens is people plant the Spanish one in wild locations rather than just in their gardens. So they might plant them on grass verges that the public use near woodlands, and that's where the threat comes from, because they do start to hybridize. But I think the Bluebell project is now finished, but it was like a 10-year project to discover how much of a threat they are. But yeah, they're very protected bluebells, and as long as we sort of keep our woodlands safe and don't sort of throw garden waste, you know, as long as we dispose of our garden waste correctly, hopefully they'll stay protected in those woodlands.
And then one final one, just can you recommend any guidebooks for children?
That's a really good point. There's some of the easier books actually split up the flowers into colour, and that's probably quite useful for children. And they tend to be just like the smaller guidebooks that you can pick up, like the Pocket Gem guidebooks. But also the Field Studies Council, they do an amazing selection, which are very child friendly, of guides. They cost about £2.50 each, and they're based on habitats normally. So it'll be like Wildflowers of the graveyard or Wildflowers of the woodland, and it will just have a few of the species, and that would probably be a bit more child friendly.
Great, thank you. That's all the questions for now.
No problem. Oh, sorry, I've gone too far. Bear with me. Right, so sorry, I don't know what's going on there. It's sort of got a mind of its own. So top tips for getting started. I've given you some basics there in terms of floral families, but here are some more top tips for getting started. So you can just go out and start botanizing. So number one, we've talked a bit about this, get a good guide and don't rely on just the pictures. You do often need more detail to identify one species from another. So read the descriptions. And if you can, try and use a key to make sure you've identified it correctly. Also remember, a tiny feature like a hairy stem or the number of stamens might define one species from another species. So yeah, always good to read those descriptions. Number 3, the keys and guides might have words you don't understand. So the glossary is your best friend and it's well worth reading through it. Number 4, get up close and pull the flower apart if you need to. You can use a jeweler's hand lens. They're quite cheap to buy and they basically make an excellent microscope in the field if you want to get really up close to seeing some of those features. Number 5, so info on distribution, habitat and the rarity of the plant can help you make a final decision. So most of the plants we encounter, they are common, and yeah, if you're looking in your book and it says it's really, really rare, it might just make you rethink that it could be a similar looking species. So yeah, those descriptions, as I said in the book, are just so helpful for that. Number 6, confirm with the experts. So Facebook groups are really, really good for this. And there's one called Wildflowers of Britain and Ireland on Facebook. I think it's got like 20,000 members, and many of them will confirm your identification. So if you post a photo, they'll let you know, if you're correct or not. So that's really useful. There's also a website and an app called iSpot, where you can upload your photos and people will online will tell you if it's correct or not. So that's a good one to look up too. And last but not least, you can try creating your own herbarium. It's a great way to learn and keep reminding yourselves of the plants you've encountered. So we'll go into that in a little bit. I'll give you some more detail on that. And I wanted to talk a little bit about biological recording. So every time you find and identify a plant, you have the opportunity to share important data with the scientific community and other botanists. So as you go out and learn and your knowledge of flowers grows, and as you become well practiced in this hobby, I'd really recommend sharing your biological records. So what is a biological record? It's basically comprised of 4 bits of information, which is who you are, your name, where you found the plant, usually just a grid reference, which you can get online, when you found the plant, so they'll need the date, and what species it is, so your identification. And submitting your records is a really valuable thing to do. The more people that submit data on nature and the more data we have, the better we can conserve it. By themselves, one of these records does very little, but together they're quite powerful. So biological records can be compared over many years to find out if a plant might be disappearing or missing from somewhere where it should be and need better conservation. And records of many different species can also help designate whether a site is valuable for nature and gets protected. So this is really one of those things where the more data we have, the more powerful it is. The UK has a really rich history of recording plant life. We've been doing it since the Victorian era and before. You saw how full that herbarium was earlier. And we have records dating back hundreds of years. So we do need to continue this tradition so that future generations have this valuable resource of data. Now, if you want to submit your biological records, there are lots of routes to share them. You can submit your biological records of flowers to the BSBI, also called the Botanical Society of Britain and Ireland, who have a big database. You can submit them to the National Biodiversity Network, also called the NBN, and they have like they'll have distribution maps, and they'll put your points on the distribution maps. And you can also share them with your local biological record centre, so that's normally the council, or again, if you pop them on iRecord, they'll automatically send them to the National Biodiversity Network. So that's quite a useful way to submit your records too and make sure other people can use them. Anecdotal records are always helpful, but you could also do a plant survey. So for beginners, I thoroughly recommend taking part in Plant Life's National Plant Monitoring Scheme. That's the one I did when I messed up and thought ground ivy was just ivy. But it's really good for beginners. You get given a local site to monitor twice a year in the summer. It's just a great way to practice identification. They normally send you some guides as well to help you. So that's a great thing to do if you want some practice. Now, another great way to aid your learning is to start your own pressed flower collection or herbarium at home. But first, I wanted to chat about the law on collecting. So it's not illegal to collect wildflowers at all, as long as they are what's called a wild plant and you have a right to be on the land. So that means that legally you can collect a wildflower growing on footpaths, roadsides, or places with public access. But if it's private land, you would need the landowner's permission. And also plants on protected sites. So if it's a site of special scientific interest, if it's a botanical garden, or if it's a nature reserve, that usually protected from collecting. And again, you would need permission to collect from there. Some species, like the bee orchid here, which is looking very nice, they are particularly rare or vulnerable, and so they are protected entirely from collecting. So like I mentioned, this includes many of the orchids and a lot of other plants which are labelled as Section 8 plants. Now, if you have a good ID guide, it will actually tell you in the descriptions if the species is protected. So this is why we try to follow the rule, always take the book to the plant for identification and collecting. Now, with any collecting, it's always worth leaving some for nature. And you can exercise your common sense with this. So if the plant is really widespread, feel free to collect one. It's not going to be a problem. But if it's the only one in the area, maybe reconsider collecting it. And picking sort of a leaf or a small part of the plant to help you identify it isn't ever going to be the end of the world, but uprooting plants is very different and is something you should avoid. So yeah, just take a part of it. So what do you need to start your own herbarium? I would suggest good quality thick paper cards or sheets, so drawing paper works really well, a flower press or lots of heavy books, PVA glue, old newspaper and grease-proof paper, so the stuff from the kitchen's absolutely fine, and some delicate tools, so paintbrushes, sculpture tools work really well. I actually sometimes use the little manicure tools that you get in a nail kit, so anything like that will work well. And when you pick your specimen, make sure it has all those ID features you need. So the flower, a bit of the stem, maybe the seed pods if it's got some, and some leaves. And you sometimes need those basal leaves closer to the bottom as well. Lay your specimen out in the position you want, showing off all those ID features as best you can on some newspaper, and then press it between another sheet of newspaper and lots of heavy books. And I'd leave it for a minimum of 2 weeks, but if it's quite juicy, it might take a month or more to dry out. Then once your plant is dry, you can peel it off your newspaper and you can start to mount it. So standard PVA glue works really well, and you just want to apply a very thin layer all over the plant stem and the leaves and at the back of the flower if you can. And once it's coated, just flip it over and position it on your card or paper sheet. Cover it with some greaseproof paper, which will peel off well from the glue, and then pile heavy books on again, and that should take about 24 hours to dry and mount. And yeah, once it's dry, add it to your home herbarium. Just don't forget to label it with those bits of information we talked about, so the who, what, where and when, and then you're all done.